Here at Birchal, we believe everyone should have the opportunity to invest in the brands they love.
With 36 successful offers closed and over $21 million raised, we are the largest equity crowdfunding platform in Australia, and we're on a mission to help startup founders gain access to capital.
So if you're looking for alternative funding for your business or looking for an early stage investment opportunity, then this is a podcast for you. I'm Claire Brown.
I'm Robin Holt, and in this show, we're sitting down with funded companies and industry experts to help you grow your business to the next level.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Birchal podcast. You've got Robin here, who's one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined by Dave from Compass Lifestyle Clinics, who's a co-founder and director of this incredibly exciting medicinal cannabis company. Now, Dave, you've already been telling me a little bit of the backstory of the company itself, and I had to stop you early because it's just so interesting to not only hear a market update on what's going on in this space, even during COVID-19, but it's super interesting to hear your backstory as to really how you got here, because we're currently raising funds on the site through Birchal at the moment, and you've raised almost 650K, and we really just launched very recently, and you've got 271 investors, and they are going really, really crazy for this business because they're so interested in not only this space, but also investing in your business. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got here, what the journey is looking like for Compass Lifestyle Clinics itself?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Robin. I appreciate it. So the genesis of the company, we started in Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada in 2017. And we were branded within Canada as Compass Cannabis Clinics. And it was much like Australia. Canada in 2015 was, say, Australia today, if you look on a timeline. And
Gotcha.
Canada had a medicinal cannabis system that existed, slightly confusing for physicians, for patients, even for manufacturers. So no one was on the same page, but the system itself had been growing quite efficiently, even with the hurdles that existed. So myself, Graham Hawkins, Brianna Martin are my two co-founders. We formed Compass Cannabis Clinics and essentially allowed for stigma-free access for medicinal cannabis appointments under Canada's ACMPR system. And that business began to grow very quickly. Canada was in the early stages of legalization under new Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It was one of his main platforms. And we could really see the development of cannabis as a business, but it also had a lot of hurdles that existed: stigma, government policy, public perception, things of that nature. In 2018, the business continued to grow very quickly. We were adding a lot of patients under our care, and Canada was also transitioning into what we call the adult use market, the recreational cannabis market. And as the company developed, we could see two different things were happening. Canada was going to become more of a recreational market, and the legs of the medicinal cannabis market were going to happen outside of North America. North America was growing very steadily within Canada. The American states that had legalized cannabis, places like Colorado, Nevada, Washington State, California, really strong cannabis numbers. There was no social issues that were coming up, good medical results. But a lot of the rest of the world outside of North America trailed what was happening within North America.
Yeah, right.
So from the Compass end, we really were looking at markets that made sense. And we've looked at Australia as one very reminiscent of Canada. So very similar people. We got a lot of Australians in Canada, a lot of Canadians in Australia, similar culture, language, different sports, different beers. But aside of that, the people are very similar. But currencies was the same under our Queen's flag. A lot of similarities that made sense. And Australia had launched a medicinal cannabis program in 2017. It was much like Canada in the early days, a lot of red tape, government challenges, but you could slowly see the steps forward happening. And so myself, Graham, Brianna, we went to a trade show in Sydney. We'd formed some connections with physicians, industry players in Australia ahead of time, and we went with no expectations. We set up a booth. We just simply said, medical patients, come talk to us. Let's find out what's going on here. And we were really bowled over by the amount of true medical need there was in Australia. really a lack of information from the patient side, questions around, I have a medical issue, I've got a parent with cancer, somebody's dealing with MS, really significant medical hurdles. They had seen results of cannabis in North America and some European countries that had early medicinal access, and they really wanted to know how to gain access. So we were lucky to form a joint venture with a physician partner, some educators in Australia, and really get the ball going on developing the Compass brand in Australia with some foreknowledge that, much like Canada, things would take time. And
Sure.
over the course of the last couple of years, we've run two different paths. So we moved into a retail path in Canada. We brought an American arm out of Colorado, a brand called Starbuds. We sold that brand in 2020 to a public company in Canada. And a lot of our focus from the tail end of 2019 up to today has been international development, specifically focused on Australia and New Zealand. Australia currently is statistically the fastest growing medical cannabis market in the world. There's a bunch of catalysts happening within Australia. New Zealand has an adult use vote coming up in September, recently launched medical program. So this is poised to be, I think, really the next 5 years. Australia and New Zealand not only are going to be the leaders in the Asia Pacific region, but on a global scale. I really think it's a comparison to Canada in 2015, and we continue to see month by month by month steady progress that's been very impressive. That again leads us to see kind of this next 5 to 7 years as really huge developments in Australia, in New Zealand, and it's the reason why we're now raising capital and focusing our development on Australia. We think it's the place to be, and there's long-term upside for many years to come.
No, fantastic. And I love how you came down here and did a lot of your market research ahead of just coming and entering the market and assuming it was going to be the same. But Australia is very much so like that in a way. While there's great innovation down here, there are a number of industries and markets which progress a little bit slower than some others. And I think it's also part of the kind of the Aussie attitude to watching how some spaces and some industries work out for other countries, and then just trying to either learn from their mistakes or do things a little bit differently, or actually just implement them exactly the same because they're working so well. And I love that you've taken obviously what you've learned from Canada, and you're right, there's so many similarities between the two countries, but being able to apply that to a new business down here, where the space really is ripe for growth. So I'd love to really understand a little bit more about how really poised for growth the industry is itself, because we were talking about some fascinating facts itself. And I think it would just be really valuable information to all the listeners out there.
Sure. So there's a couple of points that I think really show the growth in Australia. The first is the SASB approvals. So essentially, patient approvals for cannabis. It's an unregistered medicine in Australia. And if you look at the numbers from June, and again, this is during COVID, you've got these lockdowns, you've got people afraid to leave their house. It has been steadily records growing every single month. So June was the highest record for new patients, over 4,600 patient approvals in the month of June. Compared to June 2019, it was 295% higher. There's not many businesses growing 295% year over year. And even if you compared those numbers to May 2020, it was 15% above May, and May had set a record. And April had set a record before that. So COVID has not slowed down cannabis patient access. It continues to grow. We're seeing significant demand from patients that want to access cannabis. And I mean, really, if you look at conditions cannabis is effective for, anxiety is very high on that list. We're probably in the most anxious time in human history right now. The combination of COVID, social media, lockdowns, all of these things happening. So it's really helped to position cannabis well. You know, the things that cannabis does well, people are getting an understanding of and finding value from.
Sure.
The second piece that we can really look at is currently Australia is the #1 cannabis oil importer, and the oils would be consistent with a dropper under the tongue. These can be CBD, THC oils, combination of. Australia is about 450% above the next import market in the world, which is Germany. And you'd note Germany has about 60 million more people than Australia does. So Australia has moved quickly as a leading importer. It's part of developing their own in-country system. So manufacturers, cultivators, etc. Australia has an ecosystem that's developing. There's some really interesting spots, Perth, Melbourne as examples, that are developing good cannabis companies. But as we sit today, that ecosystem's not fully developed. So there's a huge quantity of oil, a lot of it coming from Canada, landing in Australia. It's been the choice of physicians thus far. And we don't see that number slowing. Again, the imports continue to increase. And that'll likely happen until the domestic market has settled somewhat and cultivators and manufacturers have come online.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's fascinating actually to really hear from an insider what's going on in the industry and really understand just what growth is not only coming from industry, but also government approvals. So I'd love to talk about the equity crowdfunding side, because a business like yourself is obviously something that can appeal to a mass market, but also it's something which can be easily understood because there's replication overseas, and Australian equity crowdfunding legislation is obviously fairly new. So when you started in Canada, it wasn't legislated over here, but being able to come over, surely looking at the options, you chose equity crowdfunding. I'm really, really interested to know what inspired you to do this over and above other funding options.
Sure. So in Canada, we've done raises through, call it your more traditional capital raising side. These can be institutions, they can be hedge fund types, individual investors. And what we found, particularly early in the cannabis investing cycle, is institutions. So if you think of a traditional bank, they very much view cannabis as high risk. There's certain stigma involved with cannabis that it's, it just doesn't seem like it's within what they generally invest
A
in.
slam dunk to them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a perception issue for a lot of institutions. But where we found good success in North America, not just ourselves, but sort of across the span of investors, was the general public was onto cannabis far ahead of the institutions. And the public supported early cannabis companies in North America when the valuations were low. So if you look at kind of the 2015, 2016 range, that was all the public investing. Those companies exploded higher 2017, 2018. And I think Australia will be no different. The general public, people we talk to, have a higher level of education around the benefits of cannabis, what they've seen in North America, their own personal use with it. They're certainly more tied into the industry than, again, call it your traditional institutional type investors. And I do believe the institutions are going to show up, but the institutions are going to show up in 2 years, and hopefully they're buying shares from our crowdfunding investors today at a much higher price than they paid for them. So that's where we anticipate the cycle going. But the public has really been on to cannabis just, again, through their own use and case effects they've seen through family and friends. They understand the business. They understand why cannabis is going to be effective medicinally, recreationally, on the CBD side. And so this felt like the best path for us. Excellent results so far. A lot of capital has come in through a very diverse base of shareholders, and we think it sets us up for a good foundation.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I absolutely, I think I can agree with you so much on the diversity factor, because we obviously get so many questions around the business itself, but there's so much excitement in the space and the opportunity for Australians to invest into, and everyday Australians at that, really to invest into a medicinal cannabis company like yourselves, which has the credibility not only from overseas, but you've got it over here as well. So I'd love to understand a little bit more about what traction you've had to date and what growth you've seen in the company since inception, and where you're at now, really, and maybe we can go on and perhaps explore what the use of funds looks like and what the future of the company looks like as well after that.
Sure. So we opened our first clinic in March 2019 in Balcombe Hills, and have had good success with it. Our clinics are termed lifestyle clinics, so it's not just cannabis. We do offer cannabis prescribing, but we've done aligned healthcare services. So cannabis isn't necessarily a cure-all or a panacea for any problem that comes in the door. If you've been in a car accident and your neck's out of place, cannabis oil, a CBD oil will help with inflammation, help with pain. But somebody like a chiropractor may actually be able to fix your issues. So we've aligned with people like massage therapists, chiropractors, nutritional coaches that can provide other services as well. And, in terms of the growth, we've seen a very steady growth in our patient inquiries, our patients we've serviced, seeing a lot of patients coming through the door. And it's become more diverse in terms of who's come through. Early stages, it would tended to be very significant medical issues. We're now seeing more of a broader range of medical issues coming through and looking for cannabis access. We opened a second clinic in the Blue Mountains recently, so it's been in operation for several months now. And really, as we look at the use of funds, two different opportunities are presented in terms of the patient care side. So we do enjoy the physical clinics. There's a lot of value that patients get from coming in, getting a physical appointment, and something like cannabis oil, which they may not have an understanding of dosing, even how a dropper under the tongue works. There's a good level of explanation that can be had from that one-on-one interaction. But secondarily, with really the COVID world we live in now, one of the pieces that's accelerated has been telemedicine services. People have been locked down. It's been a global scale in terms of that. But what that's forced to have happen is groups like senior citizens and physicians that maybe weren't comfortable using a Zoom or a Skype or a telemedicine type setup now have been forced to become comfortable in that world. And we're seeing more and more patients that are asking for telemedicine services, which is expanding quickly in Australia. We don't see that slowing either through issues of lockdown or people not wanting to go in public, or some just geographical issues. If you're further out, you can't make it to a physical clinic. It presents an opportunity to meet with a physician in a slightly different setting. So we see Melbourne as our next target market for a physical clinic, but we also really see the expansion on the virtual side, a lot of interest from patients and physicians. And then the third route that we're looking at is really on the product side. Partnered with excellent manufacturer based in Australia. We've got some partnerships on CBD products out of South America and some cannabis products outside of Canada as well. And one of the challenges in Australia that exists today is that some cannabis product pricing, I would say, is out of line to what we would find within North America, within Europe in some cases. But also there's new product categories opening up. CBD in particular, looking like it's going to be reclassified as an over-the-counter product for pharmacies in February 2021. That category has exploded in the US, exploded in the UK. We think Australia is going to hit a massive push. I really think CBD is the equivalent of the 2020s version of a multivitamin or vitamin C. It's a daily go-to for myself, for my pets, for my wife. Huge benefits, and that's a really exciting category that we anticipate is about 6 months out from really being mainstream in Australia.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. That's such a, not only looking at the perspective of obviously growing how you've grown in Canada, but then also responding to current market conditions, and obviously looking at being able to speak to a physician online is no doubt something that an area that has grown significantly in recent circumstances. So interestingly though, what I'd love to explore is there's a number of businesses who are trying to grow in this space because it's inherently becoming very well, not only worldwide is it known that it's becoming an industry that's going to grow significantly, but also there's got to be a number of businesses who are going toe to toe competitively, and what they kind of do differently, how they represent themselves and how they present themselves and how they operate is going to see them win. So I'm really interested to know actually what the differentiation, what the differentiators of your product compared to your competitors are, because there's got to be a number of factors that you've said, okay, we're going to do this a little bit differently, or we're just going to do this better than everybody else, and that's how we're going to win?
Yeah, and I think this is a unique circumstance in that cannabis and the expanding industry is not going to be a winner takes all. I think
Mm,
this is more about a high tide raises all boats sort of scenario. But that
definitely.
said, not all boats are going to be equal. And I do think there is really good developing players in Australia. And I look at Perth and I look at Melbourne. There's some really good communities that have developed in those markets. Others are developing as well. What does set us apart, I think, first and foremost is the experience factor. We've not only been involved in the Canadian market for an extended period, we were one of the original players in the Australian market, very good tie-ins to our US retail partners. So we sold the Starbuds brand in Canada. They sold it in Colorado for, I think, $118 million a couple of
Yeah,
weeks
wow.
ago. So we've got some very good aligned success. Knowing that the medicinal market is likely to follow a similar path as what's happened in North America. I think there's been a pretty standard pattern you've seen in any country or state that's approved cannabis. We
Sure.
think we know what that pattern is, and it probably helps us out. But secondarily, there's when I look at clinic groups that exist in the market, there's different models that currently exist. Some are focused on research and development projects. Some are focused on data projects. I don't necessarily agree that that's the right path. I think from our end, we want to be able to service patients. We want to bring down patient costs. We don't want to be a upfront heavy one-time fee that's getting a single use out of a patient. We suspect that patients are coming back not for weeks or months, but for years, because cannabis really is effective for their sense of well-being. And then secondarily, we look at the product side of the market, and there's products that don't exist in Australia today. There's products that exist, but the price points are certainly out of line from
Yeah.
where we believe they should be, and ultimately what we think is a reasonable price from the patient's perspective. Ultimately, this is a medical service, and if a patient can't afford either a meeting with a doctor or the product they're being prescribed, that medical service isn't providing value. And so we think some of the current pricing, it seems very inflated. It's likely not pricing that those competitors can exist off of. That to us, the model is getting a patient in. If cannabis works for them, they're going to continue to come back. Our history says cannabis is very effective for most patients. So we
Sure.
want to have this long-term relationship. And then I'd say one that, is a bit more speculative when I look at it, but the potential for adult use coming to New Zealand, the referendum's in September. They're going to vote on setting up recreational cannabis. We have a good background in that. Between ourselves and our partners, we've had exits of north of $130 million out in North America. Potentially we play in that recreational space. We'll wait and see what New Zealand look like, but the current set of regulations, I think, will poise New Zealand as a cannabis tourist hotspot.
Yeah.
And I think it's one that really a lot of eyes in the Asia Pacific area will watch New Zealand. I think they're going to be really successful as the regulations are based today. And that's going to likely expand cannabis for the entire geography, not just Australia, not just New Zealand, but when you look at other Asian markets, it likely there's poised to be growth very broadly that'll last, again, I think for at least a decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you really touched on a point there, which so many people in this space, no doubt, are always looking at, is other markets and who else is looking to grow, and what governments are looking to amend their legislation to be able to allow it in, and what markets are really demanding it. And Australia, obviously, being in a pretty unique position, growing so significantly year on year, and also month on month, even during a global pandemic. So it's such a fascinating time for people to come on board. But also, I think it seems like the time is right as well for a medicinal cannabis company to be raising funds through equity crowdfunding, when those initial individuals can kind of come in, and there was all the talk about the medicinal cannabis space and community, and now it's started to become a bit more let's just say not mature in the sense of where the market is, but really in a sense of people's understanding of really what the industry might look like. So I'd love to ask, one of the final questions, which I had in a slightly different way, but is there any questions which you feel like you get on a very frequent basis from potential investors that you really love to highlight or answer? And is there anything which you feel comes up very regularly, which you'd love to cover off in this episode?
Sure. So I think to your previous point, it really touched on something we are asked about, and it's a bit of the cycles of investing.
Mm.
And I look at it from the sense of cannabis was something that had a lot of narrative, a lot of hype behind it in, say, 2017 and 2018.
Yeah, it was
And
huge then.
the narrative got way ahead of the fundamentals of the business. Cannabis has taken time to develop. Generally, it's results of government policy, a lot of red tape, a lot of stigma that have happened. And we're now to the point, and oddly enough, COVID has been a very positive, if you could use that term, for cannabis in accelerating rethinking of healthcare for most individuals. But from government policy side, you're at this point in time where economies have froze for extended periods. Governments are now saying, we need additional tax revenue. We need new sources of jobs. Maybe a traditional industry like restaurants aren't going to be quite as busy or quite as many in operations. How do we replace those jobs? Cannabis is, it's the low-hanging fruit to some extent. It's right there. People understand the business. They understand what it is. And there's been a lot of governments. I mean, Australia has been extremely proactive with the Board of Trade in Canada. They've been very good with finding companies, sourcing investment. Really one of the best governments, if not the best government we've dealt with anywhere in the world, which catches a lot of Australians by surprise, but very proactive.
Yeah.
And we're now to the point where the narrative behind cannabis actually isn't where the fundamentals are. The fundamentals continue to improve faster than any business aside of potentially your Amazons and your Zooms, anything tech-based. But really from a business that is not a pure tech play,
of course, you've got to still grow it, right?
Yeah, it's a plant. You've got farmers, you've got science behind it, you've got manufacturers, all of these other pieces in the ecosystem. Cannabis as a business itself, the fundamentals are improving dramatically on a global scale. Any country you look at, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Africa, it's everywhere. And I think we're now at this odd point where the hype didn't live up to expectations in 2018, but that today presents an investor an opportunity to come in at the low end of the hype train. And I think maybe a comparison might be, the post-internet bubble in 2002 and 2003. That's when people thought the internet didn't live up to the hype. It was never going to, but the reality was it was a bit of a shakeout from the fake players to the real players, and it gave businesses a chance to understand the markets, let government policy catch up. And I think that's the point where we're at, where government policy is now in a good position, and cannabis itself, be it THC or CBD products, there's a good public understanding. So I think really we are in that early position, kind of the bottom is in from an investing side. We like the upside to it. And the fundamentals, in my opinion, will carry the day for at least the next 5 years. Australia is a market we think can have 350,000 patients a month. Last month was 4,600 patients as a record. So there's a lot of upside. And we're using those numbers based on what happened in Canada. Again, pretty comparable market size. So that's really one of the things we look at, I think, from the general Q&A side from investors. And on the, sort of the general questions that I get, a lot of it is around cannabis. How has it affected areas of the world where it's more prevalent? So a lot of experience for myself, both in Canada, the province and the city I live, huge cannabis hubs, spent time in Colorado, been into a lot of facilities. There's been no social issues, which seems to be sort of a concern that people have around cannabis. It has fit in extremely well in, not just North America, but places like Israel, in Africa, all of these markets where cannabis is developing. Really, it's become a good source of efficient medicine that has positive benefits for patients and drives jobs and tax revenue. And that's kind of a magical wand you can wave in today's day. And I think a lot of what catches people off guard is who cannabis users tend to be on the medicinal side. We've got patients in their 90s. We've got CEO types that work in executive suites that have issues with anxiety and sleep. You've got the soccer mom, as we call them in North America, but say your domestic 40-year-old mom that maybe is suffering from chronic pain or inflammation. It's a very diverse patient base. And that patient base may remain a bit hidden with some stigma in Australia today, but that stigma is going away. And I think much like we've seen in North America, people will become open cannabis users and advocates over the coming years. And it will be not the traditional stoner that most people think of. It's not going to have that kind of quality to them. It's a different level of person that tends to be health focused, responsible, a lot of times very higher income than expectation, or maybe an older age range than expectation. So I think that's something that will catch people off guard, and a lot of questions come in around, who is the user, how is it affected, really the social mood.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's such an interesting point which you touched on there. And I think, was it the monthly current customer count at the moment, which in Australia is 4,300, or was that the weekly?
4,600 was the number set for June 2020, which was a record. And that was, I think, 1,300 in June 2019. So growing substantially.
Yeah. And what are the numbers at in Canada on a ballpark? What are they at?
So Canada has stopped tracking over the last 2 quarters, but we're about 400,000 active patients really as we went into legalization. So if you consider 400,000 medical patients in Canada plus, and it's wildly assumptive as to how many recreational users are out there, but it's in the millions. And cannabis right now is, again, very effective from the medicinal side. It's become more of a senior service. And as we go forward, so you're seeing a lot of seniors come in for pain relief, sleep aid, palliative care, things of that nature. But cannabis is slowly becoming similar to the alcohol industry in terms of availability here, but really with the positive medical benefits. So it is certainly way more accepted. CBD products are widely accepted across all age ranges now, from weekend warrior athletes to aches and pains for seniors and everybody in between. So really we're seeing that kind of broad development. Australia's got less population than Canada, but if we factor in, call it that New Zealand, Australia market, we think 350,000 patients before Australia becomes a recreational cannabis market. I think 2025 is a timeline in my mind. But I think that's a path everybody's going to go down, because cannabis really is an industry that raises a lot of boats, provides economic benefit for the country, but also healthcare benefit for patients.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting. Really just not only hearing the perspective of the market from your place, but having this conversation around the recreational use, and also understanding the typical patient and what they look like, because assumptions are going to be made, and assumptions by sheer definition from your experience seem to be very wrong on the basis of the typical individual who's coming in, or not always very wrong, but in a lot of cases they really aren't what they seem.
It's one of the number one conversations I have in the early days, is people that will pull me aside and say, I actually use cannabis, don't tell anybody. It would surprise you who says that, and maybe what kind of positions they're in. And so there's a lot of, I think, maybe behind closed doors support for cannabis that will manifest itself when it becomes more politically acceptable to do so.
Yeah, fantastic. No, it's been so incredibly interesting to have this chat with you, Dave. And just before we close out, is there any other questions which you feel like investors should have answers to, or anything that you feel like you'd like to highlight and really address at this point?
Sure. I mean, from the investment side, ultimately, if you're an investor, the question comes back to, how do I get a return on my capital? How do I get a return of capital? From a company perspective, we're really focused on the capital market side. We're raising capital right now at 30 cents a share. we would like to get to the ASX, and obviously at a higher price than 30 cents per share. Really, cannabis is not a dividend type company in the early days. It's one where we want to get to the public markets.
Yeah.
We think there's a lot of benefits in doing so from the licensing side, which I won't dive into, but it really speeds up our ability to operate. And that's the path we intend to go down. We've been working on some of those pieces behind the scenes, but we intend to be a fairly quick mover in that direction. It's a benefit to us. We believe it's a benefit to our shareholders as well. And we think, again, there's a really long-term upside that will be presented sort of within the capital markets over the coming years. But for us, I think it's a best benefit to get there. And, we're excited with who's on board and kind of the capital that's come in. We think we can have a positive impact and really drive the company from where we sit today to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, to people who've come and listened to the end, there's 15 days left on the campaign, and we've got, like I mentioned at the beginning, there's been such an incredible level of interest in investment from such a diverse range of individuals, because you've raised almost $650,000 from 271 investors, and we really haven't been open with this campaign for that long. You hit your minimum target very, very quickly, and we've got 15 days left to offer the Australian public really the opportunity to be able to invest into Compass Clinics Cannabis, Compass Lifestyle Clinics rather. So I'd love to send everybody to the Birchal page, which I'll leave in the link below as a link below for anybody to go and check out and really just learn more about the company itself. If you want to have a chat with Dave, or if you really just want to understand equity crowdfunding a little bit more, please feel free to reach out to us. But Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on this episode and really understand a lot more about this business. It's really exciting to be working with you at this time, and I'm sure we'll absolutely smash the next 15 days.
Yeah, much appreciated, Robin. Thank you to everybody that listened. And as you said, more information there. My contact's up on the page. If you've got any specific questions not answered, please reach out and we can answer them as best as possible.
Absolutely. All right, guys. See you on the next episode.
Take care.